meet going. And I also like to thank the Sudanese Surgeons Club for giving me an opportunity. So, as Dr. Mohammed said, we would also hope the entire session is informative. I have tried to make it as case-based learning as possible because I think that is where we would learn more rather than the theoretical aspect. And I also request members to feel free to ask any queries during the session. If there is nothing else, shall I proceed with the presentation?
Yes, sir. Can proceed with the presentation.
So today we'll be discussing about malignant colonic obstruction. This will be the broad outline of the discussion that we are going to have today. First, we'll see regarding the epidemiology of malignant colonic obstruction, then followed by the presentation and pathophysiology of malignant obstruction, how to evaluate these, and what are the management options that we have. The two primary components will be surgical and endoscopic, and finally we'll have a take-home message. So coming to epidemiology, the global prevalence of a malignant bowel obstruction is up to the tune of 3 to 15%. This includes both the small bowel as well as the large bowel. But if you take patients with colon cancer, nearly a third, according to certain series, can have colonic obstruction. Okay. And more so, if we are having a malignant large bowel obstruction, that is considered the most common indication for an emergency large intestine surgery. Nearly 85% of emergency large intestine surgeries are performed for the indication of malignant large bowel obstruction. Generally, these obstructions occur due to lesions which are at or distal to the lever of splenic flexure, with nearly half of splenic flexure tumors presenting with obstruction, and nearly a quarter of the patients with lesions distal to splenic flexure again presenting with obstruction. Apart from these primary colonic malignancies, we can also have other extra colonic malignancies such as ovarian tumors, such as pelvic peritoneal mesothelioma. All those genitourinary cancers can also present with malignant colonic obstruction. For today's discussion, we will not be dealing too much into this part of the obstruction. So coming to the pathophysiology, the obstruction has various forms of presenting. So they can be either a complete obstruction or a partial obstruction. They can also occur as an intermittent obstruction with occasional acute obstruction features. And with respect to the level of obstruction, majority of the times the obstruction is at the level of tumor. Occasionally we can have even obstruction elsewhere. For example, if we have an CA sigmoid and we have an ileal loop that is adherent to the carcinoma sigmoid, then these patients can actually present with a small bowel obstruction rather than a large bowel obstruction because of the kinking caused at the level of ileum. Similarly, if a patient has a peritoneal carcinomatosis, this group of patients can present with a small bowel obstruction. So whenever we are having patients who are at multiple occlusive levels, then we should be wary of these patients because they are likely to have advanced and inoperable malignancies. And nearly 2/3 of these individuals are likely to also have peritoneal carcinomatosis. So why it is important? Apart from the poor prognosis, the surgical management options are also limited when you have patients who are having diffuse peritoneal carcinomatosis. So what are the mechanisms by which the colon can get obstructed? It can be an extrinsic intestinal compression. That is where we looked at other organ involvement. It can be an endoluminal obstruction, which is kind of more common with the right-sided malignancies, where you have the growth pattern, the morphology of the tumors that occur on the right side are likely to be more voluminous and polypoidal, whereas those occur on the left side are generally considered more stricturous. So when these endoluminal masses grow to a relatively large size, they can cause obstruction, quite rare, but more so they can have intermittent obstruction where they present as an ball valve mechanism like obstruction that we see in other parts of hollow viscous. Sometimes they can be the lead points for intussusception too. So those are again ways of right-sided malignancies which are known to have proliferative growth can present with obstruction. Sometimes we can have diffusely involved large segment of the colon that can be the cause of obstruction, which is secondary to the intramural infiltration of generally a poorly differentiated tumor. Sometimes we can have extensive mesenteric infiltration. In most likelihood, they are secondary to peritoneal disease, and these can cause acute kinking of the intestine and cause large bowel obstruction. And as I said, intraluminal tumors can also present with intussusception. So once the obstruction has set in, so the pathophysiology related to obstruction is similar to obstruction elsewhere in the GI tract. So we will have intestinal distension, which is secondary to the accumulation of fluid and gases. So to overcome this, we'll have the colicky kind of pain and abdominal distension. Generally, malignant obstructions, we are likely to encounter large bowel and they present with constipation and obstipation rather than vomiting. And whenever vomiting is there and it's fecaloid, we are like looking at a complete large bowel obstruction. So we'll have to be a little more aggressive in managing these individuals. And given the capacious size of these large intestine and gross distension of these intestinal loops can cause abdominal compartment syndrome, thereby decrease the vena cava return, and the resultant inflammatory reaction and the edema can also cause a lot of electrolyte imbalances. So how do these patients present? They have a various spectrum. A certain group of individuals present with more the chronic, intermittent, or the subacute kind of large bowel obstruction, whereas we do have patients who can also present primarily with an acute intestinal obstruction at the time of diagnosis. The second category of these individuals are most likely to be severely dehydrated. They'll have an distended abdomen during the time of presentation. And given the cachectic nature of the malignancy, they are also likely to have concomitant malnutrition. And if it's severe, we will have to suspect advanced nature of the disease. Generally, lesions which cause obstruction are likely to be Duke C or Duke D. So what are the issues associated with large bowel obstruction that we are concerned? Sometimes we may not know the diagnosis. A patient presenting with acute intestinal obstruction at the first presentation, the diagnosis will be intestinal obstruction, large intestine, but we may not know malignancy is the etiology. If some case we do know that malignancy, we still may not be able to run all the evaluation to know the appropriate staging. So why these two become important? If I'm not able to stage the patient properly, then I will not be able to prognosticate the patient. So when I'm not able to prognosticate the patient and inform the patient and attenders, then the counseling becomes difficult. Technically, since the patient is already in obstruction, we are not able to prepare the bowel. And the bowel which is grossly distended are likely to be friable. So involving them in any anastomosis or even handling can lead to a lot of iatrogenic injuries in these. Thus, these patients have a combination of poor performance status because of the malignancy and the acute deterioration due to obstruction, the severe acute illness, and the inadequate bowel preparation. So all these put together a serious challenge for the clinicians to handle the situation. So what are the things we like to evaluate? First, the clinical. Generally, again, as I said, they are likely to be poor performance status, but not necessarily always. Sometimes we might get a clue with respect to the evidence of any metastasis. So never hesitate to palpate the supraclavicular node or the inguinal lymph node in case of an rectal malignancy. or even sometimes a per-rectal examination can help us in finding out any peritoneal deposits. We'll have to assess regarding the effects of obstruction such as dehydration, the degree of abdominal distension, and one should always be wary of any peritoneal signs in these individuals because they can be a marker of underlying perforation or an ischemia. Whenever we have a perforation or ischemia, the decision making is completely different when compared to an uncomplicated malignant obstruction. When we have perforation and ischemia, the patient's prognosis further deteriorates. We have to take the patient and even more early. The outcomes are likely to be poor. So always find out if there is any evidence of perforation and ischemia in a patient who is already known to have malignant colonic obstruction. Coming to the imaging, the usual set of imaging that we perform during obstruction, such as our plain abdominal X-ray to CT. So all these things will give us clue. I will be going in detail through this in the future slides. If feasible, I would always suggest to get at least one value of serum CEA in these individuals, because any patient who's having high CEA, so high CEA, I mean it is above like 30, 40, not the usual cutoff that we are told is in case of non-smokers is 2.5 nanogram per ml, and case of smokers it is allowed up to 5. But any patient who's having some 30 or above, sometimes even 120, so these individuals are likely to have peritoneal disease. So the implication lies, one, as surgeons, we need to be aware that a patient with peritoneal disease are more difficult to handle, and two, to counsel the patient. During my early days, I do remember a patient who was, I think, 32-year-old who presented with intestinal obstruction. The colonoscopy was done elsewhere that showed a lesion at the level of sigmoid. We did do the serum CEA, but patient was taken up for surgery even before that. And when we opened, it was all studded with metastasis. The entire peritoneum, the mesentery, the bowel wall, both small intestine, large intestine was studded with metastasis. This is despite patient having very good performance status. So we couldn't do anything. We couldn't bring a loop of bowel outside to do a diversion stoma. We couldn't resect the lesion. So we had to actually abandon the procedure and close it. So we faced a very tough time in counseling the patient and the attender regarding the peritoneal disease. So if at all feasible, kindly perform a serum CEA because high CEA level can indicate peritoneal disease. I just put few representative X-rays. These I have taken from the internet just to show what are the various X-ray pictures that we can have with malignant colonic obstruction. This is a classical one. We can find the entire large intestine dilated with an abrupt cut at the level of rectosigmoid. It is the arrow pointing to the abrupt cutoff. This is another image where we can find the large intestine as well as the small intestine are dilated. We can find the left side colon is not visible in this X-ray. Again, this is likely to be a lesion which is obstructing at the level of sigmoid. But because of the incompetent IC junction, we can have the small bowel also being dilated on an X-ray. So that's the arrow which is pointing to the dilated small bowel, and that is the large bowel. I would like to just bring to your notice regarding this picture, which is rather unusual. We can find some part of large intestine which is dilated here, the incomplete ostration which is seen here, but the right side colon is basically normal. There is nothing suggestive of a gross distended cecum. Generally, in any malignancy of the left side colon which presents with obstruction, we expect the cecum to dilate first because of the Laplace law. The radius is higher, so the surface tension reduces. So they are likely to distend first. But this X-ray doesn't suggest any cecal dilatation. But we have gross small bowel dilatation, typical jejunal valvular conniventous, which is seen in this picture. So this is actually when the proximal ileal loop had actually been adherent to the sigmoid lesion. So this is what I was talking about. It is not necessary we can just have the large bowel dilatation. We can have large bowel dilatation alone whenever there is a closed loop and a competent IC. We can have large bowel and then small bowel dilatation when an IC junction is incompetent. Sometimes we can have the primary presentation to be a small bowel dilatation because of the loops adherent to the primary, as well as in case of peritoneal disease. However, given the advantages we do have with X-ray, and CT is something which will give us far more information with proceeding with the management of these individuals. One, it confirms the diagnosis of obstruction. It can also indicate the probable cause. It may not be able to tell us the 100%, but it can go up to even 95 to 98% in trying to identify the cause of obstruction. It can give us more information regarding the primary lesion, where exactly it is, what is its extent, whether it is resectable or not, and if there is any evidence of metastasis in the form of liver, peritoneum, any non-regional lymph node. So sometimes it might also give us an indication of a second lesion elsewhere. Suppose we might have a patient presenting with sigmoid, but patient can have another polypoidal lesion presenting in the ascending colon. So the ascending colon lesion was asymptomatic, but the patient had come with the sigmoid lesion. So sometimes we might miss the proximal lesion. So CT can help us in identifying, so that during the surgery we'll be a little more aware whether we need to tackle that or not. Majority of times I feel plain CT is sufficient. If the patient is unstable, at least if we can have a plain CT, then we can counsel the patient and prognosticate. If it's feasible, we can have the complete triphasic CT. So this is a graph that is I borrowed from the World Society of Emergency Surgeries, which had a guidelines published in 2018. The guidelines are formed in 2017. We can see there is a considerable increase in sensitivity and specificity. Specificities are almost up to the tune of 95%. So the same thing with respect to the confirmation of large bowel obstruction, the cause of identifying malignancy as the cause of obstruction, as well as in determining the site of obstruction, CT has a very good sensitivity and specificity. So where does colonoscopy fit in? Colonoscopy is generally reserved for patients who are in chronic kind of obstruction, who are in subacute, but they are very stable. The primary reason we would like to know is to find the tissue, and the tissue diagnosis sometimes helps us in prognosticating. Like example, a patient with a poorly differentiated carcinoma versus a well-differentiated carcinoma, the way we interact with the patient itself is completely different. So in a poorly differentiated carcinoma patient, we are going to trace that patient will require neoadjuvant or adjuvant chemotherapy. Patient is likely to have peritoneal disease or an other early recurrence. So if feasible, we should always try to get a colonoscopy. Sometimes the endoscopists may not be able to pass the scope beyond the level of obstruction. Even then, if the patient is stable, if we are able to tide over, we might get the tissue diagnosis. During the same sitting, we can also assess the lesion for the feasibility of stenting. However, the limitations include: one, in an unstable patient, we may not be able to prepare the patient, and also the availability of colonoscopy in such tricky scenarios is also sometimes an issue. So what are the factors that we need to consider when you are dealing with malignant obstruction? First is the resectability. A right-sided malignancy grossly involving duodenum and the pancreas is unlikely to be not touched with, or extensive involvement of ureter and the kidney. Again, retroperitoneal structures, psoas and nerves. These are structures which are unlikely to be removed, especially in an emergency scenario. So they become unresectable. Generally, pelvic dissection is avoided during emergency surgeries. So any lesion which is probably involving the middle third of rectum, upper third is also fine because we might get away with just above the peritoneal reflection. But anything which is going into the pelvis as such, middle third and the lower third, it is unlikely to be dealt with in the acute setting. Role of laparoscopy. Laparoscopy can be used in definitive management of malignant colonic obstruction, but given the gross dilatation these patients have at the time of presentation, a single stage laparoscopic management might be difficult. In case we had been able to decompress the bowel by say probably placing a tube, colonic decompression tube, or we are able to place a stent across the lesion, and we are able to tide over the crisis and the distension had come down, then laparoscopy is a good way to deal with it definitively. It becomes almost like a bridge to surgery. The stenting has become a bridge to surgery, and patient has now from an emergency has been converted into a semi-elective. But otherwise, in an acute setting, given the distension, it is difficult but not impossible. However, in case we are not planning to open the abdomen and the obstruction is still there, we are planning to just do an tryphane ostomy. Tryphane ostomy is where then formal laparotomy is not done, but we just make a hole in the abdominal wall, say left transverse colon is brought out. Sometimes we bring out the sigmoid colon out. So in those cases, we don't assess the lesion, we don't assess the metastasis, we don't assess other bowel conditions. So if feasible, at least a diagnostic lab in these individuals before performing the stoma can help in one, assessing the stage of the disease, and also to determine the aggressiveness in which we'll have to give the neoadjuvant therapy in these individuals. Once after diversion is done, obviously all these patients have to undergo neoadjuvant therapy before the definitive management. So if I'm able to get an information regarding the degree of peritoneal disease or liver mets, then I'll be able to offer a better chemotherapy regimen. Whether the lesion is associated perforation. So these perforations can be just proximal to the stricturous lesions, or as I mentioned earlier, the cecum is the first one to get distended during sigmoid or left colonic obstruction. So sometimes we can have the cecal perforation, which is associated with left-sided colonic malignancies. So in those cases, it is we'll have to go with subtotal colectomy. And nowadays, with the more aggressive oncological treatment that patients are receiving, we'll also have to see whether they have been treatment naive or they have received some form of neoadjuvant chemotherapy. It is not uncommon for us to find a patient who has an upper rectal or a mid-rectal tumor who was initially not in obstruction but was subjected to neoadjuvant chemoradiotherapy because of the advanced nature of disease. And during the course of chemoradiotherapy, patient develops obstruction. So that is going to be different from a patient who has primarily presented to us with an obstruction. So that is where we need to identify, because whenever we have a patient who is on chemotherapy, and if it's less than a week from chemotherapy, all their parameters, wound healing are going to be difficult. So an aggressive surgery should be avoided in patients who have not come out of the chemotherapy effect, say probably 3 weeks from the previous cycle. So this is actually, I wanted to place this as the first factor that has to be countered in. But then I decided I'll place it as the last, because the criteria have changed over years. Initially, when we are learning in the training period, I was told if there is peritoneal disease in an colonic malignancy, then palliative surgery. If there is liver lesions which are multifocal, then palliative surgery. Then came with for aggressive liver surgeons, we started dealing if it's bilobar multiple liver disease, then palliative. But I think the role of either it is a curative surgery or a palliative surgery depends on so many factors. Say, for example, this is a PET scan of an individual who presented to us December last year. This was the primary lesion. It was an rectosigmoid and upper rectal tumor. We can see the multiple liver lesions here. It was bilobar. It was quite large volume. So if I had actually gone by my training days, I would have labeled him as palliative care. But after 4 cycles of chemo and bevacizumab targeted therapy, the liver lesions have practically vanished. There's one small foci here and nothing seen on the sagittal cut. So why I wanted to emphasize is, it is prudent on the part of the surgeon not to label a patient as palliative, because the advancement in oncological drugs we have right now with respect to colorectal malignancies, we'll always have to attempt for curation. If the biological behavior is so bad that we are not able to cure, then the patient comes under palliative. So for that, we'll need some time to assess the biological nature. So always try to attempt cure and think of curative surgery rather than label a patient as for palliative care and do suboptimal surgery. So coming to the surgical management, so I have just tried to divide it into right colon and left colon. Right colon are those lesions which are proximal to the splenic flexure, and left colon lesions are the ones distal to the splenic flexure. The right colonic lesions are generally uncommon in kinds of presenting with obstruction because of the lumen size. The nature of the tumors are less likely stricturous. The nature of stools are also likely to be more liquid and semi-solid rather than the solid which we encounter with the left colon. So the management, however, is straightforward with respect to right colon. If resectable, then proceed with surgery. That is with the curative intent. Even in case of low volume, sometimes we find a peritoneal disease which is confined to the peritoneum of the right iliac fossa. Sometimes we might have small deposits in the nearby mesentery. So rather than labeling them as palliative or metastatic disease, if a low volume mets is found, it should also be removed along with the tumor, provided the primary lesion is resectable. How do we classify low volume mets? Some oncologists, I think even I believe that if the PCA score is less than 6, and if the patient is otherwise having good performance status, I would like to do the cytoreductive surgery along with the surgery for the primary, rather than just do it for the primary and wait for the florid peritoneal disease to occur later. If it's anything PCA going to be above 6, then there is no point in doing just a cytoreductive surgery, because these are patients who might require HIPEC. In case of unresectable or a high volume disease, then we might have to look at diversion, typically in ileostomy. Sometimes if we find the patient is not likely to benefit much, or patient has already received chemo and has not shown much of improvement, rather than doing a permanent ileostomy, we can do an iliotransverse bypass because that improves the quality of life. So this is a 41-year-old individual who presented to us with intermittent subacute intestinal obstruction for a period of 2 months. So we can find the classical bowel in bowel appearance. See, this is the target sign that is described generally, where we can find the outer bowel, the inside bowel. We can also see the leash of vessels which are found in the mesentery of the bowel that is intussuscepted. And the third figure on the panel also showing the leash of vessels which are going into the intussusception. So this patient underwent right hemicolectomy. She had an PT2 lesion, and there are no lymph nodes out of the 32 lymph nodes that are resected. Meaning to say, she had a very early stage. So she was lucky enough for a right-sided malignancy to present with intussusception, PT2N0, and she didn't even require adjuvant chemotherapy. This is an elderly man who presented with anemia and subacute intestinal obstruction. He was classically saying he couldn't determine when he got into obstruction. Suddenly, you will have abdominal distension and feeling of nausea. But after a few days, a few hours, he will have the relief by passage of stools and platters. So this patient was evaluated, and we found a lesion at the right colon. This is a right hemicolectomy specimen. We can find the large lesion here. This is a typical malignant transformation of an adenomatous polyp. You can see the proliferative nature and the amount of lumen that is likely to occupy. So basically, it was functioning like a ball valve obstruction. That is why the patient had intermittent subacute intestinal obstruction. That was PT3 lesion. This is a 25-year-old female who underwent, who had a large bowel obstruction. This is the transverse colon. So as soon as the incision was made, this is the large, this is approximately the proximal 1/3 of the transverse colon that has popped up into the wound. This is a growth that was obstructing. The distal bowel is more or less collapsed. So again, this was an lesion that we could resect, and then primary anastomosis was made. So again, all these right-sided lesions, whenever they are possible for resection, feasible for resection, resection will be the first choice. The reconstruction is for the surgeons to decide. If the patient is otherwise having good nutritional status, for example, in both the intussusception patient as well as in the ball mechanism obstruction patient, they were otherwise doing fine. So we went in for a primary anastomosis. But for this individual, 25-year-old female who had an obstruction for 7 days, was not taking orally adequate, her albumin was 2.5. There was an debate whether we should have gone in for a stoma formation first. So always the resection or stoma becomes can be part of the algorithm. But whether the reconstruction has to be made or the stoma has to be matured, that is based on each individual case and the surgeon's judgment during the surgery. Coming to the left side colon, it has undergone a period of evolution. So initially we had 3-step procedures. So any patient who came with a left-sided colonic obstruction, they underwent a diversion stoma, either the sigmoid or the proximal transverse colon. Then after the patient settled down, they underwent the resection of tumor with again the stoma remaining, and finally the reconstruction was made. But over periods of improvements in surgical techniques and the anesthesia, which is able to take care of our acute derangement in these obstructive patients, we started being little more aggressive, and we tried to reduce it to a 2-step procedure. So it involved resection of the tumor and stoma creation at the first setting, followed by reconstruction at a second setting. And nowadays, even if it's feasible, we might go ahead with a single-step procedure for a left-sided colonic obstruction, where we can do a resection and a primary anastomosis. So this is a 40-year-old individual who presented to us in December last year with, I think he was 300 kilometers away from Chennai, where he had obstruction and colonoscopy was done, which showed some lesion at sigmoid. Biopsy was taken. Then patient had to come here because the obstruction was not relieved. The CT then there showed a classical large bowel dilatation. You can see the hostrations, the transverse colon dilated up to the right side colon. There's some amount of prominence of small bowel as well. Liver did show a cystic lesion. It was not in the form of metastasis. Other cross-sectional images showed the small bowel dilatation too. And we could find the primary, which was more in the distal sigmoid. We can see the acute abrupt transition point where we have the dilated proximal sigmoid with the distal rectum completely collapsed. So we took up the patient for surgery. As with the CT, intraoperatively we found the hugely distended large intestine as well as with the small bowel, and we can find the stricturous growth which is present in the more distal sigmoid. So how do we proceed? Whether we need to just do a stoma and come out, or we need to resect. That is, either we need to look at diversion stoma, or should we resect the primary. So whenever the lesion is resectable, and if it doesn't involve a pelvic dissection, I think the first choice should always be resection. The reconstruction, again, as I said, it's up to the surgeon's judgment, whether the primary anastomosis is made or the two ends of the resected ends are brought out as stoma, or in Hartmann's is performed. So just to validate this concept, in 1995, we had a good study. It was, I think, involving around 120 patients, wherein they had tried to place in 2 groups. The group T had just a diversion that was done. The group R where the resection was done. So what they found out was the complication didn't vary much. See, the general assumption is if we just make a diversion stoma, we can tide over the crisis, and then the patient can become better, and then we can perform resection. But the complication rates were very similar between the 2 groups, starting from wound dehiscence, septicemia, post-operative deaths, all were similar between the 2 groups. In fact, the resection group had an advantage because rather than doing the 3-step surgery, now it is 2-step surgery. So the overall hospital stay is reduced in these individuals. So whenever we are having a resectable tumor, it is better to perform Hartmann's. So similarly, in this patient, the patient underwent Hartmann's procedure. And whenever we perform Hartmann's in these individuals, it is better to do with adequate lymph node clearance as well, if it's feasible. Why? because this patient with presented with obstruction likely to have T3 disease. Already there is one risk factor of obstruction, so they are likely to receive chemotherapy before we plan for Hartmann's reversal. So if we are also able to get good lymph node yield, we can tell the oncologist that this was the lymph nodes. They had 20 lymph nodes, out of which only 3 were positive. So the prognostication becomes easier. The choice of chemotherapy is dictated by the exact information that we give during surgery. So try to perform an oncological surgery whenever we do a Hartmann's procedure. So we can find the distal stump that was closed, and it was fixed to one of the lateral pelvic walls, and the superior rectal artery was preserved. We went along the skeletonizing the superior rectal artery and went to the IMA, and then we divided the proximal and brought it as an Hartmann's procedure. So eventually it was an PT3N1C disease with evidence of lymphovascular invasion. The patient completed 8 cycles of Capox and is actually planned for Hartmann reversal 2 days later from now. So we did review CT and CEA now, and both were normal. So this is another individual who was an elderly male who presented with upfront liver mets. He initially had rectal bleeding as the indication for evaluation, which showed an moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma at the rectosigmoid and upper third of rectum. And imaging showed an multiple liver mets which were involving both lobes of liver. So he underwent chemotherapy as well as targeted therapy. Initially, he had Capox with bevacizumab, then only Capox. So we can see the response was pretty good. These are the comparative FDG PET images. The top panel showing the December images and the bottom one showing the February images. So after completion of 4 cycles of bevacizumab, there was a definite reduction in the liver lesions. So patient was continued on 4 further cycles of Capox. The plan was to give 8 cycles of Capox and take up for definitive surgery. But patient, after receiving 5 cycles on April, he defaulted. He didn't come for the 6th cycle. So when he presented to us on 5th May, that is almost a month after the last chemotherapy, he presented with complete intestinal obstruction. So these were the images that was taken during the presentation of obstruction. So we can find the entire large bowel dilated. This is the descending colon. This is the ascending colon. I just wanted to just point out a few things here in this image. We can find there is incompetent IC junction. That is going to tell us that the small bowel is also going to be dilated. We can also find there's a layer of air column that is surrounding this inferior aspect of the cecum. So whenever we have an dependent air, that is, we expect the air to rise up when the patient lies in supine position. Whenever the air is in the dependent place, then generally we think in terms of pneumatosis intestinalis. But if it's pneumatosis, then it could be a marker. It is not always, but it could be a marker of ischemia. Then the cecum is likely to be ischemic, and the surgery should involve addressing that lesion as well. But I would just like to make a note here. We can find the serosa is well demarcated here. In case if it's in pneumatosis that is caused by ischemia, generally we have an serosal inflammation too. So yes, we did have a suspicion whether patient is having colonic ischemia, but we are not too much worried because of the absence of this serosal inflammation. So this was the primary lesion. Now from a gross extensive, it has definitely responded to the chemotherapy and has shrunken in size, with forming a stricture lesion with proximal dilatation and distal collapse. That is the lesion. So what are the decisions we had to make? We had to go in, but we know once we open the abdomen, the intestines are going to pop out like anything. So how to decompress, whether we need to give an on-table irrigation or we need to just manually decompress. There have been few RCTs that have been conducted in this regard. So in on-table irrigation, what generally is preferred is we divide the bowel distally, and then we do an appendicectomy, place an irrigation catheter to the appendical orifice and irrigate it. This is on-table irrigation. The other is manual decompression, where after division we do the milking of the large intestine. So whether these two are different with respect to each other, uh, I have performed a few on-table irrigations, but I am always little apprehensive regarding the leak, because uh, these solid contents, when we give irrigation, are now going to be more liquid, and it's likely of soiling the wound as well as the peritoneal cavity increases. And doing an appendicectomy in an already ischemic cecum, I am not very sure of also. So I prefer the manual decompression. However, the various RCTs and even meta-analysis have not shown any difference between these two techniques of decompressing the bowel. So whether Hartmann's or the primary anastomosis with or without stoma in this individual. So what are the factors? Hartmann's, yes, see, Hartmann's basically becomes a straightforward decision because we have a lesion there, it's resectable and it's causing obstruction. But what happens is when it's involving the upper third in this individual, we should also be aware that he's one going to need reversal, and during that time it is going to be very demanding because the stump is likely to recede further into the pelvis. Two, once we remove the primary, the oncologist is going to give radiotherapy. That is not going to be stopped just because we have not done Hartmann's. So post radiotherapy, doing an pelvic dissection, identifying a very small stump and trying to re-establish the GA continuity is going to be even more demanding. So it was a very tough choice, but again, I should emphasize, and proximal protective stoma done after anastomosis should not be considered as a substitute for Hartmann's. In case if there is a doubt that the colon is hugely distended and it is still filled with feces, it does not be able to evacuate with any of the two measures, that is irrigation or decompression, it is preferable to do an Hartmann's at that stage. Because I do find sometimes surgeons believe we can do the reconstruction and do a protective stoma. But the remaining stools which are in the ascending colon, transverse colon are likely to leak in the from the anastomosis if it's not properly performed. So proximal stoma, there will be neither decreases nor the incidence nor the severity of the anastomotic. So this is from a systematic review which spoken about the colonic irrigation versus manual decompression. Various outcomes were measured. The anastomotic leak at 30 days, again they were comparable between the two arms. The infection at the 30 days, again comparable between two arms. The mortality were also comparable between the two arms. So coming to the Hartmann's in this individual, in an emergency setting, still Hartmann holds good. We can find this is a 2004 study it's from the German, where they had 20,000 of colonic resection that were performed, but those fitted into the obstructive left colonic are around 1,500. So among the three groups, you can clearly find there is an Hartmann's procedure patients are likely to have an higher ASA. You can see that 10.9% of Hartmann's had ASA 4, whereas the other reconstructed had less than 3%. Similarly, emergency setting Hartmann's is likely to be performed more. But as I said, the surgery upfront, Hartmann's is a very good option. But when it comes to reconstruction, Hartmann's have a lot of technical issues. So this is from a very old article, I think it's from 1995, published in American Journal of Surgery, where they just tried to identify all the patients who had undergone Hartmann's reversal. So they found whenever it's done for diverticulitis, 70% underwent the restoration of bowel continuity. But when it's performed for malignancy, only 13%, that is 8 out of 68 patients who had underwent Hartmann's for malignancy alone had underwent Hartmann's reversal. The reasons why it was not performed were many. It can be due to the medical condition, patients refusing, advanced nature of the disease where they found a recurrent rectal cancer at the rectal stump, sometimes the incontinent lower anal sphincter valve. So all these play a role. But I'm just trying to point out, Hartmann's is very good for the first step, but we might have issues when we are going to the next step. This is in contrary to the first patient whom we saw, which was a distal sigmoid, where I know the rectal stump is going to be adequate. I know it is going to be above the pelvic brim. I know patient is not going to give going to get radiotherapy, and is very well performing individual who is not going to have issues with the anal tone. So therefore, in this individual, we proceeded with resection and anastomosis rather than Hartmann. So why not subtotal colectomy in this individual? It does make a job easier whenever we remove the entire large intestine. However, the functional outcomes over long term are going to be poor because the small bowel is now going to be directly anastomosed with the rectal stump. So hence, it is primarily indicated only in case of an associated right colonic ischemia, any incidence of cecal tears or perforation, and synchronous proximal malignant tumors are present. So this is a Scotia trial that studied the single stage treatment of malignant, where one arm had a subtotal colectomy, the other arm had a segmental resection with an irrigation. Coming to the operative complications, both are similar. There are no difference between the two groups. Over a period of time, we can just find the group. This is a scatter plot curve where they had tried to graphically represent the daily bowel frequency. The subtotal colectomy patients had a definitely higher frequency, 3 to 4 bowels. Some even had 5. Whereas in case of sigmoid, the bowel frequency is slightly lesser when we did a segmental resection. So over a period of time, obviously the subtotal colectomy patients are going to have a slightly poorer quality of life. Hence, it should be not advised unless indicated as mentioned previously. So this patient had an diagnosis of metastatic carcinoma rectosigmoid, which was resectable, and a complete intestinal obstruction. We had a good biologically behaved tumor. So we know that this patient had responded to chemotherapy. That is going to have a very good impact in the decision making. Suppose the same patient had progressed during the surgery, probably we would have done even a diversion. We would not even have performed a resection. And even if we had performed a resection, we might have just confined to an Hartmann's. Since we know this patient had a good biological tumor, and the resection went up to the prostate because the tumor was involving up to upper third and part of middle third, and patient likely to receive radiotherapy, we went ahead with the low anterior resection with the colonic manual decompression, primary anastomosis, and then covering loop eyelids. So patient did well, and now he is being planned for further chemotherapy to address the residual liver lesion. So this is another individual who presented to us 80-year-old male who had an incontinent lower anal sphincter with gross scrotal edema and brawny induration of entire lower limbs. Rectal examination showed a growth. Patient had come with intermittent features of obstruction. So there was an MRI done, which showed, see, we can find the gross edema in the entire muscular plane, and then very hazy tumor that is involving the entire mesorectum. I'll show further images. We can see this is more like the similar to linitis plastica of stomach. We can find the submucosal spread of the tumor, which is going for a very long distance, and we can say the inflammation which is going even up to the presacral fascia. So this patient had an biopsy which showed a poorly differentiated tumor. The growth was seen intraluminally at 10 centimeters. CA was 113.8. So now we have an 80-year-old individual who's having even the scrotal edema is likely due to the lymphatic obstruction rather than the anasarca we get usually in poor nutritional status. So that is a marker of an extensive lymphatic involvement, CA elevation. So we did anticipate in this individual that we are likely to encounter peritoneal disease. So we decided with an DLAP. As expected, there was diffuse peritoneal disease, predominantly in the pelvis. The PCA score was 8 out of 39. We took biopsies and we just performed a loop transverse colostomy. The patient was placed under palliative care. So I placed this case because however aggressive we are, if there is a biological poor tumor and a patient with poor performance status, it is better if we can do a DLAP, assess and completely document all the information and then perform a stoma rather than just perform a stoma. Because in case we had just performed a stoma, then obviously there will be a question which is after a month or two, if patient was doing fine, some will question, was there truly a peritoneal disease? Was there, could it have been resected? So all these things will start cropping up. So wherever feasible, just do a D-lab and gather all the information. So diversion for rectal lesions, it avoids pelvic surgery during the emergent conditions. The choice is transverse loop colostomy or sigmoid colostomy. Generally, what happens is nowadays, because the radiation field includes part of the pelvis, which is coming up to the suprapubic region and midway between the umbilicus and the pubic symphysis. Sigmoid colostomy is being avoided in general because it comes within the radiation field. Then the peristomal skin changes because of the stoma as well as the radiation causes a lot of trouble for the patient. However, if the lesion is likely to undergo APR in future, suppose patient comes with obstruction, we find it to be low rectal cancer, which is involving lower 1/3, and patient is likely to have abdominoperineal resection as definitive management, then it's preferable to do a sigmoid colostomy than a transverse loop colostomy, because after performing sigmoid colostomy, we can give the radiation, we can downsize, we can do the APR, and the same sigmoid loop can be fashioned into an end colostomy. So the trifine colostomy, where we don't open abdomen, is preferable whenever we are doing. Again, before trifine, if it's feasible, kindly assess the peritoneum by means of diagnostic laparoscopy. So having all discussed the various surgical options we have, so we should also keep in mind certain scenarios where our hands are tied. So this is a patient who was a 54-year-old male who presented with recurrent subacute intestinal obstruction. For a period of 2 months, he was evaluated elsewhere. Colonoscopy showed a possible growth at the rectosigmoid. They didn't take a biopsy. But when he came to us, he was in already like 2 weeks of obstruction. He had not taken anything by mouth. Rice tube was 2 liters in output. We got an imaging done. So just to go through the imaging, we can find the large intestine dilated. We can find the peritoneum, which is, you can see a lot of interbowel fluid here. I hope you can be made out. These are interloop fluid. The small bowel appears thickened. There is some haziness of the mesentery at the joining of bowel and the mesentery. So we were looking at a picture where peritoneal disease is a possibility, but this patient is not taking anything by mouth. So we thought we'll give him a chance by doing a diversion so that at least something can be fed into his mouth. So this is what happened when we opened. It was a completely plastered small bowel. We can find there was a layer here. This was typically an abdominal, malignant abdominal cocoon. The entire small bowel are arranged in a pattern, fold pattern. You can see that they were all stuck to each other. They are not freely moving small intestinal loops, which can be fashioned into an stoma. And even dissecting between these two loops was actually fraught with danger. We felt we could cause more iatrogenic injury. We tried to push every intestine loop, and finally we found something. We couldn't still reach the rectum and the sigmoid. We found some lesions in the mesentery, which we took biopsy, and those came out as poorly differentiated carcinoma, and likely colorectal origin, given their IHC pattern was CDX2 positive and CK20 positive, CK7. So we didn't do anything for this patient. We opened, we couldn't actually close. We made a laparostomy, and once the report came, we spoke to the attenders. We told it has a very poor prognosis. Now he is not able to take anything orally. So then we didn't do any active resuscitation in this patient. A few words on endoscopic management. It can be decompression tubes, which are more commonly used earlier days when we passed across the obstruction and which could be relieved. But generally, the lumen of these tubes are small, so solid stools are less likely to be decompressed. The other option is laser therapy. Again, not commonly available, not commonly performed. The more commonly used endotherapy is the self-expanding metal stents, which are radio-opaque tube-shaped metallic meshes. We have both the covered and the uncovered. Generally, in case of malignant obstruction, we use an uncovered stent because the chance of stent migration is lower. So once they are deployed, they gradually increase their diameter over a period of 2 to 3 days, and thereby reduce the chance of migration. We need to know the length of the stricturous lesion. We need to know the width so that the stent can be used properly. The angulation, sometimes an angulated sigmoid can cause a lot of issues in properly deploying a stent. If there are long strictures, we might require overlapping stents. So I just had two videos from the this is from the YouTube, just to show how they can be different. They are not the straightforward in all cases. So here the colonoscopy is passing through the lesion. We can find any entire unhealthy mucosa. Now it has gone to the normal mucosa. So a guide wire is now placed at the level of normal mucosa, and the colonoscope will be gradually withdrawn. So this is a typical lesion which I spoke about, the intramural infiltrate. We do have a lumen. We do we can see we could pass a scope, but these are likely to be obstructed because of the long segment intramural involvement. So these are technically difficult. You can find there is also an possibility of creating false passages. So once the guide wire is placed, the scope is gradually withdrawn, and then over the guide wire a stent is placed. Once the stent is placed, we can find it is expanded and it is placed there. It should at least cover 2 centimeters from the tumor end, distally as well as proximally, so that there's a good catch, and we can find they have a flanges to prevent stent migration. This is the fluoroscopic image showing the stent placement. So in case of subacute obstruction, we could go through the lesion, but if there is complete obstruction, this may not be feasible. The scope cannot be passed through the lumen. So for example, this, we can find the lumen completely covered by the growth. So after biopsy, they're just blindly inserting the guide wire. So this is the entire redundant sigmoid. So probably at the level of descending sigmoid junction, there is the growth. So they have kept the endoscopy at the level of the growth. So gradually, they will be forwarding the guide wire. So we can feel the guide wire that has crossed the level of obstruction and then it's going up. So over this, the stent is placed and deployed. So why I just put this video? In the earlier one, we could see the lumen, we could go through the lumen and be sure that we had placed it across the lesion. But now we could not even pass the scopy. So blindly the guide wire was placed and then the stent was deployed. So you can see once the obstruction is relieved, how copiously the liquid contents are coming out. So technically, if the stent is placed properly, it is considered technical success, and if it's causing bowel decompression, it's caused for clinical success. The success rates are up to a tune of 90% in both the aspects, but we should be careful that they are not indicated when we have known perforation. So they can be used either for palliation. We have a patient who is having an advanced disease, poor performance status, where surgery is not contemplated, then place a stent there. At least obstruction is taken care of and patient can be put on palliative care. If the patient goes in for further obstruction during the period of palliation, and another stent can be placed within the stent. So it has the advantages of having an low short-term mortality, shorter hospital stay, lower stoma rate, and early start of chemotherapy. Sometimes when the patient presents with acute obstruction, we can tide over the crisis to take them for a semi-elective or an elective surgery. So in these scenarios, it is called as a bridge to surgery. So it is associated with lower stoma rate, because we know the bowel is, we can prepare the bowel now, the higher chances of primary anastomosis rate. But of late, there have been some concerns regarding the oncological outcomes, because there have been few papers, including from Annals of Surgery, where they said placing a stent can actually cause an micrometastasis of tumor cells, and this can over a period of time reduce the overall survival or increase the early recurrence rate in this. So that is something we need to be careful about. So finally, if it may not be comprehensive, if there is a way in which we can put everything into two tables, in case of a right lesion which is resectable with low volume meds, then the surgical procedure should be resection. If it's going to be unresectable, or if it's going to be gross metastasis, then a diversion stoma or even a iliotransverse bypass can be performed. When it comes to left-sided lesion, that is distal to splenic fissure, any patient with good performance status, either with no metastasis or low volume metastasis, resection should be the first choice. Again, whether we mature the proximal stoma or go for a primary reconstruction is left to the surgeon's prerogative. In case of a poor performance status or a metastatic where we likely to be palliative, we can go for a diversion stoma or an endotherapy. So finally, the take-home message is clinical presentation is variable and sometimes difficult to diagnose preoperatively, except for a low rectal CA where we can identify it with respect to digital rectal examination. So however much we can get information like cross-sectional imaging, like colonoscopic biopsy, like CA, whenever it is feasible, we need to get it done, including the diagnostic laparoscopy. The general dictum is for right-sided obstruction is resection. For a left-sided obstruction, resection is preferred, which includes Hartmann's. A diverting stoma should be reserved for severely ill and where SIMS was not feasible. It is a true challenge for any colorectal surgeon. So it involves a lot of decision making that has to be performed. The likelihood of cure, the future chances of having an APR versus a low anterior section, the requirement for neoadjuvant chemotherapy, as well as a lot of technical issues. Whether, see, if a resection is required, the resection has to be done properly. If an anastomosis is required, then anastomosis has to be performed properly with no complication that should arise out of it. Similarly, if a patient is put on palliation and a stoma is fashioned, the stoma has to be perfect. The worst thing that we can have is a patient placed on palliative care to have a stomal gangrene or a stomal retracted or a gross peristomal excoriation. So any surgery that is performed in these scenarios has to be near perfect. And more importantly, we need to counsel these patients and their attenders whenever we take them for surgery, because the management is finally decided at the time of surgery. So we should make them aware that we might be able to resect, we may not be able to resect. It can be palliative, it can be a permanent stoma that we might have to mature. So all these counseling has to undergo preoperatively so that we don't leave anything for surprise. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gassam, for this very nice and informative and very precise presentation. I think it's the time for discussion. Anyone have any comment or question, please raise your hand. We welcome all the participants. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed Muhammad Adam, Mr. Ahmed Muhammad Adam. Please unmute yourself.
Good evening for everyone. Thank you, Dr. Fosian, for this very thoroughly elaborated talk covering aspects of malignant colonic construction. Thank you very well indeed. Actually, I have one comment and I have the two questions. We are seeing here a lot of cases of a malignant obstructive colon that it came almost late. I mean, the necessity of surgery sometimes it takes the priority among doing any staging or diagnostic tool. So you mentioned that the bypass surgery in proximal tumor, one of the options. I need just to ask about the oleostomy versus iliotransverse anastomosis in right chronic tumor. Which of them is superior according to your experience?
So generally what happens is when we have a right-sided lesion, we are confined to ileostomy. But if it's going to be left-sided lesion, I would prefer colostomy to any day to an ileostomy, because we don't know about the status of IC valve. In case the IC valve is going to be competent, still we can have a closed loop obstruction between the tumor and the IC valve, so cecum. So I would prefer a colostomy in any case of left-sided malignancy rather than an ileostomy.
Thank you very much. I know that there is many factors that playing hand by hand role in deciding whether you are going to resect or whether you are going to do a and all we know that the decision is encountering some patient factors as well as the surgeon experience, putting in our mind that all these patients are coming without fully worked up as a case of a possible malignant lesion. Now, generally speaking, in colonic cancer, surgery comes in front, and in rectal tumor, that new adjuvant is coming in front. Resectable or having any local invasion, new adjuvant is coming from recently. Now, you mentioned that you are adopting some diagnostic lab in cases of rectal tumor conjointly with either a transverse colostomy or sigmoid colostomy. Just I'm asking about the diagnostic lab in a rectal tumor that it might not show even the pelvic spread. I mean that it needs might need.
So the diagnostic lab as such in carcinoma rectum is not usually performed. It is performed only when we have a high suspicion of disease, given the factors like high CA and the differentiation of the tumor is going to be very poor. In this individual, the plan was like we are a center where we do laparoscopic rectal surgery also. So the plan is to proceed if it is going to be resectable. So we didn't take up as such like DLAP. In case this patient had presented to us with a complete obstruction, probably we would not have performed with gone ahead with diagnostic laparoscopy. This patient had subacute, so we were given all the bad factors that were associated with this tumor, the large diffuse type of tumor with high CE and poorly differentiated nature, and the picture of lymphatic obstruction shown by his scrotal disease. And so that was the indication for DLAP. Here, the reason why I postulated that I requested for a DLAP in other subacute scenarios is majority of times we do find the oncologist and even this patient as well as ourselves, we become little confused whether peritoneal disease were existing before or it is a new onset after the chemotherapy. Once the diversion is performed, patient undergoes chemotherapy. So it becomes little difficult to talk and counsel the patient as well as for us to know whether the biological behavior of the tumor is aggressive where we can go slow or it is passive where we can be a little aggressive. So that is why where I feel we can utilize diagnostic labs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome, Professor Ali Gilai and Professor Rashid Ahmed Abdullah and all other participants. If anyone have any comment, please unmute yourself. Dr. Muhammad Ali, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
First of all, thank you, Professor, for this informative lecture and presentation. I have one question. You mentioned comparison between single-step and multi-step surgery for left side colonic tumors, either to go for reconstruction directly or you do colostomy first, then you send the patient to come for another surgery. We know we have limited time, especially in emergency situation, as patients present with intestinal obstruction and limited resources to full work up the patient. My question is it possible to do single stage surgery for left side colonic tumors? As some papers and some surgeons, they say if left side colonic tumors, if they present with obstruction, it means it's already advanced tumor. And there is the second question, if there is any place for sandwich therapy for left side colonic tumor, I mean neoadjuvant chemotherapy, surgery, then adjuvant chemotherapy. And what is the benefit from that? Thank you.
So thank you, sir. I think two valid questions that have been asked. The first, with respect to the, I'll finish with the neoadjuvant therapy. So there is always difficulty in judging a patient will go for obstruction or not. If there is any features of obstruction or even subacute obstruction, it's better to remove the lesion or at least perform a stoma before the patient undergoes chemotherapy. Because often we do find a patient who receives chemotherapy, the lesion can either progress by biological nature, or because of the edema, the obstruction which was partial can go into a complete obstruction. So unless the obstruction has been taken care, if it was significant, unless it is taken care, either we can do a diverting stoma, or we can do a resection, or we can place a stent. So any of these three, if it's not done, we might land up with an uncomfortable scenario where patient received chemotherapy 1 week back and we are now looking at an completely obstructed tumor. So that is a place I think surgeons we would not like to be. If there is a small suspicion also, it's better to tackle the obstruction before starting neoadjuvant. That is one thing. But as you said, neoadjuvant in colonic malignancy is generally not the rule. Rectum, yes. In colonic, now when the patient has liver mets and the primary is asymptomatic, that is the time when we have started giving neoadjuvant therapy. So if the patient is going for obstruction, then the primary has become symptomatic. So the surgery has to be offered to these individuals. At least some form of management of the obstruction has to be done. That is one. With respect to the first question that was placed, that left-sided malignancies are likely to be advanced and it is better to put them on palliative. It's very true that left-sided malignancies are more likely to present with obstruction 1. The outcomes, long-term outcomes of patients presenting with obstruction versus patients not having obstruction at presentation, that is left-sided colon, sigmoid malignancy itself, the outcome is going to be poor in patients who are going to present with obstruction. However, they are still going to be far, far better rather than not giving any treatment. So the risk factor of obstruction comes in counseling and prognostication, but not to deny treatment to these individuals. So we need to have when we discuss with the oncologist, with the patient and ourselves as part of a team, we should put forth this as an adverse outcome is expected after obstruction, but still it is better than not offering any treatments.
Thank you, Professor, for this answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Muhammad Taifour, welcome. Please ask your question.
Yeah. Hello, Professor. Thank you for this presentation. I'm concerned about the cytoreductive surgery along with the image resection of the tumor. What is the limit of the peritoneal cancer index for doing cytoreductive surgery in the cells? Do I have any limit in the peritoneal cancer index? Thank you.
Sir, we go with the PC of 6. We try to, with the Porridge trial that was recently published with HIPEC, that had even validated the same cutoff as 6. Anything less than 6, HIPEC doesn't have much of a role. So in those individuals, if the patient is having good performance status and the tumor needs resection, resectable with a limited low volume like PCI less than 6, I would prefer an surgery for the primary as well as the cytoreductive surgery, so that we achieve CC0. Sir. Anything more than 6, it is better to plan with neoadjuvant therapy if the primary is asymptomatic, neoadjuvant therapy, and plan for an HIPEC rather than doing a half-hearted approach of removing the primary. So the cutoff is 6.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Ammar Saleh, please unmute yourself. Ask your question.
Thank you, sir, for this informative presentation. My question is, in those patients with left colonic carcinoma stage 3 and stage 4 with rectal involvement and liver mets after downstaging by chemoradiation, is there any benefit to do coloanal anastomosis in those patients?
Sir, I think we are looking at multiple factors here. So once we know this patient has an rectal lesion with multiple liver disease, we are placing them on neoadjuvant. I think we are looking at 3 things that will dictate our aggressiveness of surgery. One is the symptomaticity of the primary, whether it is symptomatic, and the extent of liver lesions. And third, and I think is the most important, is the response to the therapy that we have given. Suppose this patient has a very good response to the neoadjuvant chemotherapy that has been given, then I think we should offer the best surgical treatment that can be given, that includes an coronal resection and removal of any liver mets that is possible. If the liver mets is going to be voluminous, probably we can do the liver mets first and do a second stage rectal surgery with coloanal anastomosis. I don't see a reason why we should not offer coloanal anastomosis after ultra low anterior resection in a patient who has responded very well to chemo, provided we are able to get the R0. The levatrine is clear. Sometimes we might have to do an intrasphincteric resection as well. Yes, the quality of life following a coloanal anastomosis is going to be slightly lower than an conventional colorectal anastomosis. But if we can provide an oncologically R0 resection, I think we can still offer it to a patient.
Thank you, sir.
Any question? Welcome, Dr. Ahmed. Please unmute yourself.
You mentioned, sir, that the success rate of reversal of Hoffman procedure in patients with cancer is reaching up to 13%. And we are here doing a lot of cases of Hoffman procedure, possibly not for colonic cancer, possible for other causes, but still we need to have some elaboration in this point. Would you please give us a few hints why these 3% are the
Sorry, sir, I couldn't get your question completely. Can you just repeat it?
You stated before that the success rate of reversal of Hartmann in a patient with operated for cancer is reaching 13%. You mentioned in the previous slide. Am I right?
Yes, sir. Regarding Hartmann's and
Regarding Hartmann for Hartmann reversal later on.
yes, sir. So the
Yes.
difficulty in restoring. Are you talking about that, sir?
We need to elaborate about the reason behind it. Look,
Yeah.
yeah, the difficulty of restoring a Hartmann in about 13%.
Sir, yes, sir. The Hartmann's, again, the first step is going to be very good for the patient. We are also having a resected tumor, so we know the biological nature. We can do a proper oncological survey of this patient. But coming to the reversal of Hartmann's, I think it's technically demanding surgery. If not, if it's going to be even more difficult than the first surgery for which the Hartmann's for which it was performed. Even if we go to the best of best literature, the failure of patients to undergo Hartmann's reversal can be up to the tune of even 30%. This article showed a very high percent of 87%, but even otherwise it is 30%. If I'm not wrong, the Gordon's colorectal book mentions that despite having adequately worked up, despite giving adequate time for the inflammation to settle down, despite having an adequate stump, 4% of the individuals who are taken for Hartmann's reversal may not be able to undergo Hartmann's reversal because the stump may not be able to be identified. So the second surgery is going to be very demanding when we are doing Hartmann's, especially if the stump is going to be below the pelvic rim, which is usually the case. So that is where I think it's a 50-50 call, sir. Going by strictly by guidelines, I think still Hartmann's has to be performed when we are doing dealing with lesions which are going into pelvis. But the second surgery is going to be technically demanding. I think that is where we need to be careful.
Thank you very much.
If no more question, I think it is the time to say please to accept our sincere appreciation for the outstanding presentation you made to our Sudanese Surgical Club. It is really very interesting to hear about your experience teaching us about colonic obstruction, and we hope to see you at next meeting to talk to us about stoma-related complication. Sir, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. It's been an honor to address the gathering. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you.